Good morning, everybody. Wait, is this working? You can hear me? I'm a youngest child, so the reason I'm standing here is I always have sympathy for the people in the back. Whenever we took trips, I was always the youngest and was always in the back, so I figured if I'm here, you guys have an equal opportunity to hear anything that's going on. Plus, I have a serious condition I've had my whole life called ants in my pants. In Yiddish, it's called Spilkness. I can't stand still. And all the years I've been teaching, I've always needed to move around. And when I see a podium, it's like the kiss of death for me, so because I can't move. Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be helping you on the early part of your journey. I can't go with you to get the wine, however, which I'm very disappointed about, but I know you're going to have a wonderful time here. Now, my mother always told me, never go to a party empty-handed, so I brought all kinds of stuff about the Pat Brown Institute, and I'm going to pass it around, plus the staff always tells me, never go anywhere without, plus my card, so if you ever want to be on our mailing list, I can put you on it. The Pat Brown Institute, of course, is not the Jerry Brown Institute. My students always think that Pat Brown was the grandfather of Jerry Brown, and that the guy who was the governor in the late 70s and early 80s is the father of the current governor. It's awfully hard to explain that one person was both the youngest and oldest governor in California history. There's a kind of a time travel thing in this that's just so weird that we just don't know where to go with it. And he's passed through so many transformations, and of course, we'll talk about Jerry Brown today. I'm going to go all over the place today. I want to talk about why California even matters, and to do that, you have to understand the weirdness of our Constitution. So the national context of California, what's been going on in California, and how it might affect some of the work that you all might be doing in the next few years. I have to start with something called the Constitution. The Constitution, I love our Constitution. It's a creaky but lovable document. It's the oldest working Constitution in the world. I'm not sure we can always use the word working literally for our Constitution. It's something I aspire to in my later years. I'd like to be known as creaky but lovable. So if the Constitution could do it, I think I could do it over the next few years. What the Constitution does is it creates an American system which is unlike any other democracy in the world. And that's got some pretty serious problems to it. In most countries, you just have to vote a couple of times every few years. And when you do, you change the government, you change the policies, and the party that loses goes into purgatory for years and has to straighten it out and figure out what to do next. They can't go win control of the states in the country. They can't get the ability to block what the winning party gets in Washington. Instead, they have a wonderful plan too. And that eventually leads to something called what we refer to as gridlock. But gridlock is not really well understood in this country. It's much more serious than gridlock. What it has to do with is the fact that each party thinks they have a legitimate claim on power. There's no other democracy in the world that really sets up a condition not just of gridlock, but where both parties actually feel justified in the gridlock, because after all, we won a bunch of elections. This is a big problem. And the other thing about our Constitution, of course, as you all know from your political science classes, is it was really an agreement among the states when it was created, and the states remain enormously powerful. Now, on the good side, someone once said the states are the laboratories of democracy, as if each state is run by governors in white coats with little scientific measuring things, and each one competes to do the very, very best they can to come up and test ideas. And when it works in one state, they'll adopt it in another, and then we'll adopt it nationwide. It would be wonderful if it happened that way. Instead, what we end up is California versus Texas, where we operate in completely parallel, opposed universes, and then try to steal each other's companies. Laboratories really shouldn't operate quite that way, although from what I know of UCLA and USC and Berkeley and Stanford, they probably do. but at least in theory they shouldn't. Democratic theorists, with a small d, people who study democracy, have always said the fatal flaw of the American Constitution is that it could get to a point where those competing forces are so sure of themselves that the system itself could actually be in serious jeopardy. We're not quite there yet, but there's times when I could actually see how it could happen. Now, we're not going to get rid of the Constitution. The Constitution is going to be with us forever. We have to work within it. But here's what it means. You have to understand your state because your state matters. If this was France, there's no equivalent of the state of California. No battle between California and Texas. Now, what's also going on under the surface are tremendous changes in the politics of the country that are spilling over to California. Some of those changes started here and are spilling back to Washington, D.C., but in very different ways. So what you got to keep in mind is we're not in isolation here. We're part of a big national political, quote, conversation, but it's a pretty loud conversation. It's not a friendly conversation. Well, politics doesn't have to be friendly. But what we say is being watched around the country, and what's going on around the country, we're watching here. We're embedded in a national political situation. So what's going on in our country right now? One of the things that's really striking in this country is the rise of new electoral forces that are tremendously different than anything we've seen in the past. A lot of things are happening that have really not happened before. One is that young people are voting differently than their elders. Now, when I was in college, we used to talk about the generation gap until pollsters looked at it and discovered there was no appreciable difference between people my age and our parents, even at the height of the Vietnam War. Which is pretty odd when you think about that. I mean, there are all these Newsweek articles about the angry youth. I was an angry youth, and I thought there were a lot like me, but it turned out there really weren't that many. And then when we got older, we got a lot less angry. Well, actually, that's not true now. According to recent polls, younger voters are dramatically different than older voters in this country, and it crosses over all racial and ethnic groups, men and women. If you're younger, you're very, very different. Other things have changed. One is the rise of communities of color as major factors in American politics, what we refer to as the coalition of the ascendant that came in with Barack Obama in 2008. Young people, African Americans, Latinos voting in very large numbers, Asian Americans, and I'm going to say women, and then I'm going to clarify what I mean by that. I mean, not what I mean by women, but what I mean by women as a group. Remember the gender gap that everybody talked about? There's this huge gender gap. Men and women vote differently. Actually, the gender gap's not that big. Gender gap is probably 8, 10, 11 points. The gap is, of course, as I know many of you know and have heard, is the marriage gap. The most important and dynamic changing group in American politics are unmarried women. That's women who have never been married, women who are divorced, women who are widowed. Is a gigantic constituency, and the only reason it matters is their voting patterns are so different than married women that it's like two different universes. In 2000, among married women, Barack Obama was defeated by a few points. He received the votes of 70% of unmarried women. He beat Mitt Romney 70 to, I believe it was 29. And there's little rounding errors and stuff like that. This is pretty astonishing. What's more astonishing is that those numbers weren't true 20 years ago to the same degree. Nor were there as many people in the category of unmarried women. And the real question becomes, will unmarried women vote? They have very low voting turnout compared to married women. Now, this year, both parties are desperately trying to win the votes of women. Republicans are trying to maximize the votes of married women, and Democrats are trying to maximize the votes of unmarried women. That's what's going on. Now, let's talk a little bit about another thing our Constitution does regarding women. A recent study found that the United States ranks 98th in the world in the representation of women in the major legislative body of the nation. Now, referring to the House of Representatives as a major legislative body strikes me as a little bit overgenerous, but legally, that is what it's supposed to be. 98th. Now, how could it be true that both parties are spending everything they've got to attract the most important voting bloc in the country, which normally now casts up to 54% of all votes in national elections, which is women, but women rank 98th in representation? It's because of our constitutional system that elects people one seat at a time, instead of allowing the parties to basically say, we need more women candidates and we're just going to put them on the party slate. What happens in Europe in a parliamentary system is a party will just say 50% of our candidates are going to be women this year because that's smart. They could just dictate that. Here, the parties can't even dictate who's going to win the nomination of the party in a seat for Congress in Modesto. You can barely do that. And men have a lot of advantages in those races. So you've got this huge confusion between the importance of women as voters. Fundamental. By the way, unmarried women were the largest single block of voters for Barack Obama in 2008. More than African Americans, more than Latinos, more than youth, and more than Asian Americans. It's the oddest thing that the system at the electoral level is not matching the importance of women at the voting level. It's very, very strange. So the parties are trying to figure out what to do about this, but the parties are not parallel. You know, when reporters cover politics, they always love to say that both parties are exactly the same. They're both rotten. If there's a fight, he said, she said, as they call it, that type of reporting. The parties are really very different. I would say that nationwide, and maybe a little bit in California, the Democrats are becoming the everybody party, which sometimes has problems with it. Every new group seems to be trending Democratic. But the Democrats are having a lot of difficulty delivering things for those groups because of the way the constitutional system is set up, and they could very quickly become a demoralized majority. The Republicans, on the other hand, are a highly motivated, highly mobilized minority of everybody who's not in those groups that are coming up. Now, in a European democracy, the Republican strategy would be insane. And everybody's writing these articles, when are the Republicans going to reach out to all of these groups? When someone keeps doing something over a long period of time that you think is insane, you might ask yourself if it's insane or not, or if in their terms it's quite rational. Which is, since the system gives you a way to block the other party from delivering on its agenda, and gives you the opportunity to control whole areas of the country that can be in your hands, and you do that by mobilizing a very militant, unified base, even if it's a narrow, dying base, you could do this for a pretty long time until you wear out the majority and they lose interest in politics and evaporate. If you think that can't happen, by the way, you haven't been to meetings of Democrats very much. Democrats get demoralized before the meeting starts. They walk in the door and they say, nothing's going to happen. There's really no hope. Then in the meeting somebody says, well, it's going to take 2 or 3 years to make this happen. I say, 2 or 3 years? I've got a dentist appointment at 4 o'clock. We need health care for everybody, and it's really got to be working by this afternoon or I'm out of here. So again, it's not irrational. If you can hold back the tide, our system gives you the opportunity to hold back the tide. If women are trending Democratic, then get the men all riled up. So you'll find that a Republican meeting these days often consists of older white men, but at least they're angry. See, I'm from New Jersey. I'm not against anger in politics. I think anger is better than being demoralized. I mean, angry people can be very successful in politics. It's the demoralized people, the ones who give up, who become much less successful. So it does lead to odd things, though, when Republicans try to appeal to women. You know, you've seen the famous picture of the congressional hearing on women's reproductive health with 8 old white men discussing their views, usually informed, by, as I recall, by extremely sophisticated biological understandings of these things. but it mobilizes the base, especially in the South and parts of the Midwest and rural areas, where our peculiar system of drawing House districts can probably allow them to control the House of Representatives for another 15 years, most likely, and thereby succeed in blocking the agenda of this new generation, which is very excited but very impatient, and immediately ready to give up at the first signs that it's not going to happen overnight. Immediately. If you haven't had this experience, by the way, of talking to people who have voted for the first time in 2008 and are astonished that the millennium has not yet arrived in terms of social justice and announced that they're leaving, you haven't read the latest Pew poll of millennials, in which people report agreement on almost every issue with the Democrats, and then are asked at the end which party they support, and they said, well, I can't see any difference between the two parties, so I don't know. That, of course, is partly the inability of the Democrats to communicate to their own base, which is a typical problem of Democrats, but how quickly people can become demoralized. Now, because we're in 2014, we're in what's called a midterm year. No other country has midterms. Midterms are the stupidest thing ever invented in world politics. Just like when you took a college class. Everybody hates the midterm and nobody wants to show up. You want to show up for the final. The final is every 4 years. So we invent this thing called the midterm. Now, wouldn't the midterm make sense if the midterm was, I don't know, a midterm? By which I mean, what if every 2 years between the presidential election we said, so what do you think? How are things going? And we say, well, we think the president's okay, but he's not so great. Okay, well, let's smap him around a little bit. That would make sense. Oh, no, we don't do that. We don't put the president on the ballot in the midterm. We put everybody but the president on the ballot in the midterm, and then the voters of the 2nd District of Iowa get to determine whether or not the president's agenda gets to be passed. And to make things even better, Democrats don't like midterms and Republicans love midterms. I wonder why. It might be because the people who voted in midterms are older, rural, white, married people. I'm married, and I guess the feeling is that you got nothing to do but vote when you're married. You're so tired, and you had a bad argument that day, and you figure, well, what the heck, at least I can vote. Unmarried people maybe could go to a cafe, maybe go have some fun, go do some stuff. So they have no time to vote. Young people hate midterm elections, and if you talk to a young person, they'll say, oh, I voted for Obama in 2008. Why do I have to vote in 2010? Didn't I already do that? And I say, well, young fellow, may I explain? You don't live in a parliamentary system. He says, what's a parliamentary system? I say, okay, you didn't take my class. I'm sorry we can't go there, but you should actually vote all the time. Vote for everything. Water board, chicken organization, whatever, because one of them may turn out to be the one the Constitution says is important. Just by accident, you might vote in a midterm election. Unmarried women don't turn out in midterm elections. Latinos don't turn out in midterm elections. Almost every Democratic constituency purposely stays home to make a point. I don't know what point they're making, but the point usually is that the entire Congress swings away from the president they just elected 2 years ago, blocks the president, and then young people and other Democrats say, well, I told you no change was possible. Why should I care? And I want to say to them, well, did you vote in 2010? They said, well, of course not. And I say, well, I'm going to have to smack you. It doesn't usually work, by the way. Smacking voters only works on the East Coast. It does not really, that's the style back there. So you've got this crazy midterm. So what's likely to happen in 2014 is pretty much the same as what happened in 2010, which is the president will have a huge victory in 2012, followed by a significant defeat in 2014. And then he'll hang on there for the 2 more years until Democrats get what they really want, which is the election of Hillary Clinton in 2016. Of course, Democrats should not be talking about 2016 until 2014 happens. But you can't convince that of Democrats, who, like many people, only like to talk about the things they do well, which is presidential elections. Republicans only want to talk about things they do well, which is midterm elections. Do you see the conversation? is kind of odd between the two parties. They're not talking about the same thing. Republicans could go on like this forever, and so can Democrats. Because Democrats will keep winning presidential elections, and Republicans will keep winning these statewide elections, and these congressional elections, and the Senate elections. And then the reporters will say, there's gridlock because the two parties aren't nice enough. That's not true. There's gridlock because the Constitution set up a system that is perfectly designed to create this kind of a mess. Now, whichever party figures out how to solve their problem will dominate the country for 30 years. If the Democrats figure out that there's something other than the presidency, they will be amazing. If the Republicans figure out that in order to win the presidency, they can't be a party of old, angry white men, then they'll succeed. They'll succeed immediately. Whichever party goes to their weakness, not their strength, will be successful. Now, a lot of this, what I'm talking about, started here in California. I've been in California since the 1970s, and when I moved to California, California was a Republican-leaning state with a lot of Democrats. Democrats could almost never win a statewide office like governor. It was extremely difficult. The only way a Democrat could get elected governor was to be named Brown or to be the chief of staff for somebody named Brown. That's Gray Davis. His excuse was that he was Jerry Brown's chief of staff, so it was okay. Beyond that, no Democrat could get elected governor in the last 70 years in California. It was a state where white voters dominated, and minority voters always were the sleeping giant. Everybody said the sleeping giant is asleep and will never wake up. It was a state where Republicans, even in Los Angeles County, were very, very strong, and even in the Bay Area, not as much, but had a very strong base. Then in 1994, the most remarkable thing happened, which is Governor Pete Wilson put Prop 187 on the ballot to deny public benefits to undocumented residents. It passed with 63% of the vote. Seemed, as they used to say when I was a kid, it seemed like a good idea at the time. It re-elected an unpopular governor. The most devastating commercials showed people crossing the border in very kind of dark colors with a tagline where a voiceover said, "They keep coming." Now, because Latinos didn't vote much in those days, it seemed like kind of a cost-free plan. There's nothing better than having a group that's unpopular and doesn't vote, because you can smack them around like for the next 50 years. What it never occurred to people was that people would watch those commercials and get very angry. In the decade of the 90s, 1 million new Latino voters entered the rolls. Many people became citizens in order to become voters, and when they swore the oath at the LA Convention Center, they would walk off the stage after putting their hand up, and they would see two booths right there. One for the Democrats, one for the Republicans. And they'd go to one of them, like the Republican one, and say, "So, who is that fellow Pete Wilson? Which party is his?" And the person would say, "Oh, well, he's ours. He's a Republican." They'd say, "Well, I'm going over here." And in overwhelming numbers, they registered Democratic. And not only did they register Democratic, but they were poorer, more working class, more likely to vote Democratic, and they entirely transformed the California electorate. Now, Republicans felt with Prop 187, at least they weren't going to lose Asian Americans. Maybe they were going to lose Latinos, but they'd be fine with Asian Americans. Does anybody understand that the fastest growing group in the United States is not Latinos, it's Asian Americans? They grew at the highest percentage of growth in the last decade of any group in the country. And in 1992, Bill Clinton lost 2-1 among Asian American voters. And Republicans felt this is going to be a great group. It'll be a conservative group, a pro-business group, and they'll understand that Prop 187 was not aimed at them, it was aimed at people from Mexico. Well, let's just say the message didn't quite get across the way they had wanted because it was perceived as aimed at immigrants. And when you discovered the number of undocumented people in the Asian American community and the number of recent immigrants, this had a transformative effect on the Asian American community. And within years, they were registering and voting Democratic in large numbers. Barack Obama got over 70% of their vote. That's a complete flip from 1992. Now, how did Republicans lose young voters and women in California is a different thing. It was not Prop 187. It had largely to do with what we call social issues. We started calling them social issues because in the 90s and 80s, people were so uncomfortable talking about the words that were actually behind the word social issues. Nowadays, we talk about abortion and gay rights and reproductive issues and stuff like that, like it's normal conversation. I do remember a time when people would say those issues, and say, well, let's just call them social issues. Pretty quickly, young voters turned out to not be very conservative on social issues. I think that's not too surprising. As the unmarried women grew in numbers, their liberalism on these issues got stronger and stronger, even among Republicans and people who are conservative on other issues. And little by little, the California Republican Party, which retained its conservatism on social issues. Now, by the way, if you want a losing strategy in California, be conservative on social issues. In Arkansas, it's a fabulous strategy. I'm all for it. Mississippi, it's a real winner. Go on a bus and talk to a random voter and say, I really think we need to clamp down on all this behavior stuff here in California. The guy says, that's why I moved here. I grew up in Arkansas. I moved here so I could behave in all the things you don't want me to do. I mean, it's a catastrophic position to have taken. One of the things that started to happen, and it's happened in the last few years, is the more people have become socially liberal, the more weird stuff has been said kind of on the other side about issues having to do with, well, we're now allowed to talk about sex and politics. That's a huge advance, by the way. It used to be if you had an affair, like when Bill Clinton had an affair, which you may have heard about, he had to refer to those events that occurred at that time with that alleged person at that person's point in time when something might have occurred. Now they put out selfies, so it's out there. I can tell you, by the way, as a member of what I'm willing to argue is at least in the top two genders. I'm willing to say we are definitely in the top two. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to keep my mouth shut on the topic of women's reproductive health. The odds of my saying something stupid are so high, and in general, the odds of my saying something stupid are so high, that why add to it by giving my opinions on scientific studies in this area that I'm sure many women would find fascinating to gain my insights on. Or put another way, no woman has ever asked me for my insight on those issues, and I have not offered them. It would appear in politics now that as one party becomes more older white men who have never minded offering their views on these matters for their daughters, for their wives, for any woman who shows up and have a discussion about it, are now saying them publicly. And there is a big movement in the Republican Party, I think that's informally called the Shut the Hell Up movement. We don't need to change our positions on issues, but perhaps we should not offer our opinions quite as freely on issues like what constitutes rape and what actually occurs after rape, and you can just see people just losing their minds over this. Now, in California, this is just fatal. Now, who gets really wiped out in all of this in California is the nearly extinct species in national politics called the Republican moderates, which is a very big group of people in California. Very big group. Think about who those are. They are people who don't think there should be so much government regulation of business, who are fairly moderate to conservative on business matters, tend to agree with the Chamber of Commerce on issues, but are socially liberal. I may be talking about a certain bodybuilder, for example. Could you imagine Arnold running as a social conservative with his life? I mean, really, he had no way. Arnold is the perfect example of what used to be the dominant political force in California, which is the moderate pro-business Republican. And when you talk to moderate pro-business Republicans in California, they sound like they're homeless in political terms. They say, I don't want to be a Democrat. I don't like the Democrats. I think my party is insane. But they usually mean by insane the social issues. That's what really bothers them. And on some issues, I think the government should expand food stamps but not have so much regulation. You know, that's a very winning position in California. That's a very popular position. You could probably get elected governor with that position if you could get your own party to allow you to run on that position. So these moderates, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how there's plenty of hope for these moderates if they figure out kind of where they want to go. This has led all these trends to a massive takeover of California politics by the Democrats. Now, in recent years, how extensive is this takeover? In 2010, Jerry Brown ran for governor. Young fellow then, he was in his early 70s. Ran against somebody named Meg Whitman, who I believe spent the entire gross national product of Belgium on the race. And Jerry Brown knew what the fundamentals were in the race. There just aren't enough Republicans. Give you an example. There's now 28% of the state's registered voters are Republicans. Even in 2004, there were 35%. This means that every afternoon, as we're sitting here right now, there's about 10,000 people leaving the Republican Party in California. And another 10,000 will leave tomorrow, and another 10,000 will leave the next day. They're not necessarily becoming Democrats, because the Democratic numbers are not going up. They're moving into something called oy vey, a plague on both your houses, your party. I'm so depressed political party of former Republicans who now refer to themselves as independents because they'd like to be invited out for dinner or run for office. My good friend Dan Schnur, who's running for Secretary of State, a wonderful guy, has to explain why he worked for Pete Wilson. He explains it very well. He left the Republican Party a few years ago and is running as an independent, which is a brilliant way to run for Secretary of State. I wouldn't rule out the chance that he could pull it off. Plus, he's the only candidate who the reporters actually want to quote commenting on his own race, since he's a commentator. Yeah, I think Dan's doing very well, said Dan Schnur. He really has a shot, said Schnur, and I think he'd do a fabulous job if he's elected. So you've got this massive takeover. How massive is it? Jerry Brown does nothing until September of 2010. Doesn't spend a dime. Keeps telling people, he gives them all this Zen stuff. You know, you have to wait until the warrior comes over the hill, and then Jerry, just say don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes. You know, that has like a double meaning with Republicans. But I mean, the point is, they're coming over the hill. He doesn't spend any money, and she's like spending like crazy. And then in September, he runs a few ads and beats her by a couple of million votes. It's like, why did he campaign at all? You know, given the base the party has, she really has no chance to win the election. But meanwhile, Democrats start working on something else, which is dismantling some of the things in California that prevent the majority from ruling. One of which is the budget, which required a 2/3 majority to pass. And they go to the voters, and the voters pass a measure to have a majority budget. And boy, the contrast to D.C., where Democrats waited 6 years to take on the filibuster. And in brilliant Democratic fashion, pick a time several months before they'll probably lose their majority in the Senate to take on the filibuster. I mean, timing is everything in life. So when you've got 6 years of untrammeled power, especially the first 2 years, definitely let the other party block your proposals as much as they possibly can. And then when you're about to lose power, get rid of the filibuster, which you may want after the Republicans say, there's no telling. Democrats in California are a little more confident than Democrats in Washington, which wouldn't take much. But basically, they got the voters to give them majority power. Now the Republicans don't have to be negotiated with on the budget anymore. And then, 2 years later, they take over a 2/3 majority of both houses of the legislature. That didn't last too long. Corruption has a way of knocking off your 2/3 majority pretty fast. But for the last couple of years, the Democrats have had a 2/3 majority, which means they can put measures on the ballot with that 2/3 majority. They can override the governor's veto. That's hilarious. Like they're going to override Jerry Brown's veto. That is not going to happen. But mostly what it did is it gave them a sense of morale that they could do stuff. So here's what happened with the Democrats in power. That's where I'm going to go to, and then we'll start taking questions. Everybody's studying what California has done. Now, when Jerry Brown was elected, California was a national joke. Now, I'm here to tell you, having grown up on the East Coast, California is always a national joke. When I was a kid and said I was moving to Los Angeles, goodbye, my family acted like I was going to go on a Peace Corps mission to a really strange country and never come back. And probably get kidnapped by dope fiends and lunatics and turn into a skateboarder instead of a fully employed human being. It didn't help that when I moved to LA, I moved to a little beach house in Venice that was named Ozone Avenue. When people asked what I was doing, I said I was living on ozone in Venice. I think my family thought ozone was a new kind of like hallucinogenic that we were doing here. Relatives would come to visit, and the Hare Krishnas would be taking the elephants down the beach when they came by. I mean, so really, it's always in people's heads that we're crazy. Well, when the California budget fell apart after the recession, and things were going badly, California wasn't just a laughingstock, it was a punching bag. California, the next Greece. So what those have to do with each other, don't ask, but California was the next Greece. If we keep going the way California is going, the whole country's going down the tube. So we elect an old guy as governor, give him party control, remove the ability of the minority party to block action, which of course none of those conditions can occur in Washington, D.C. And what happens? Well, he goes back to the voters in 2012 and asks them to pass a temporary tax increase called Proposition 30. Everybody says that can't possibly pass because everybody in California votes against taxes. Jerry Brown says young people will pass it. They said, yeah, but young people never vote. Jerry says it's a presidential election. Young people might turn out. He came to my campus to speak in favor of Prop 30. Big turnout of students. He gave a rip-roaring Jerry Brown speech, which he can do. You know, sometimes it's like the Zen, and sometimes it's the rip-roaring, old-fashioned Pat Brown-style speech. The students went out and organized. Prop 30 passed. The state now had money. The economy starts to come back. The budget starts to look better. And before you know it, we're trying to decide how to spend our surplus. And now people are writing articles called California is Back. All about how Jerry Brown is the greatest thing. The Economist wrote about it. I think in Timbuktu, I think there's like a little public policy institute that's studying Jerry Brown. Even the East Coast press is writing about it, about how California is doing so great. Now we're doing pretty well. I never like to get too high and too low in these things because I'm familiar with something called the business cycle. Good times followed by bad times, but we're doing pretty well. So how does Jerry position himself? Very cleverly, when you're old, take advantage of being old. He's the adult in the room. What's the great fear of Democrats having power is that they're going to spend like crazy. I don't know where that came from. I can't imagine why anybody would imagine there's a spending agenda in the Democratic Party. It's only fundamental to the Democratic agenda, and that's the legislature. And Jerry gets up there and just says no to everything. He says, even when things get better, we're not going to have everything. Now, that's wonderful if you're a Democrat in the legislature, because then you can propose everything. And if it doesn't happen, you've both secured the budget, and you can blame Jerry Brown. And he's so popular that he doesn't care one way or the other. He's just having a great time with his wife and his dog. Apparently, when you go to the governor's office, there's like no staff there. It's like him and his wife and the dog. And they have a couple of friends around, and they like send stuff out. He says people talk too much in politics, which is unusual for a politician to say. So, there's too much talking. So I think I'll just like sit around and read Voltaire. So he's having a ball. He's having just the time of his life. And then he vetoes stuff. Then he signs stuff. Then he vetoes stuff. But what he's established is very smart, which is there is no route to success in California with your bill unless it goes through me. You may not like it if I veto your bill, but there's only one vote in California government right now, and it's Jerry Brown's. I think that's pretty smart. When you get to a certain age where you don't care anymore about certain things, you can just say, well, what are you going to do to me? Kick me out of the marathon? Really, there's nothing you can do to me. So he's riding high, and this leads to an important question that I want to circle back to. Are all of these developments catastrophic for Republicans, for business in California? And I'll tell you the answer is oddly no. And here's why. What's been killing Republicans and business in California is the Republican Party. Because when the Republican Party was able to block things in Sacramento, they could demand total unity from all of their members. Because that's what you can do. That's what happens in D.C. Even a moderate Republican in D.C. has to vote against Obamacare because that's the party position. And since the party position depends on your vote, you have to vote that way, no matter what the people in your district say. When your party is knocked out of power, the whole argument for everybody towing the party line goes right out the window. But we've got a couple of other things that are very weird going on. One is called the top two primary, which I get calls and people say that people in politics hate this. I say, I love this. This is so quirky and bizarre that you can end up with two Democrats running against each other, two Republicans running against each other. Do you remember Howard Berman, the former congressman from Los Angeles, who ran against a guy named Brad Sherman, and they called it the ERMS race. They hate each other so much, by the way, at this point. Sherman beat Berman. I know it's hard to remember who beat whom. Sherman beat Berman. Sounds like a Dr. Seuss story. And when Sherman got there, they wouldn't give him an office because all of Berman's friends in the Democratic delegation hate him so much. I think he's in a bathroom on the third floor, which fortunately he has his own bathroom, which is nice, but apparently it's his office as well. And now one of Berman's closest friends is running against him to try to knock him out. One of my friends who's a Republican in the San Fernando Valley said, for the first time in my life, I got mail before the November election because both Berman and Sherman knew that the only way they could win was to get Republican votes in a Democratic district. It's brilliant. Eric Garcetti defeated Wendy Gruhl for mayor in L.A. by getting 70% of the fairly small Republican vote. And in a close election, that guaranteed his victory. So think about it. When the party fails, if the party has become rigid and narrow, suddenly individual Republicans are free to go their own way, which means they can also join up with Democrats who are not towing the party line in the Democratic Party. Do you know there's a lot of pro-business Democrats in Sacramento? This is the bane of liberal Democrats, that there's so many pro-business Democrats in Sacramento. Don't think that 2/3 is a unified anti-business majority. And if they join forces with pro-business Republicans who can now go wherever they want to go, they're free agents now, who knows? And what that means is this majority's got some tough issues to face. How to keep this majority, the supermajority, together when the majority's not united. After all, they are Democrats, but in addition, there's pro-business Democrats, pro-labor Democrats, and when you consider how many regional divisions there are in California on issues like water, rail, and stuff like that. Jerry Brown is heading into the really tough issues right now. Is there going to be high-speed rail? What do we do about the drought? You know, if you ride up Route 5, you see these signs about water. Screaming. In fact, they're very clever. You actually read them as you go. It's like 2 sentences, and you read them along the way. Rural legislators probably have more in common with each other than they do with their political party. Farmer constituencies that can cross party lines. The inland area can go either way in party politics. As long as the party can't dictate what you do, coming to solutions about these things are going to be very, very hard. But here's what also gets kind of weird. High-speed rail, which has been Jerry Brown's one of his big issues that he says we really got to do, is really stalled right now. It's really having a lot of problems. He's going to have to make a decision pretty soon. I don't get paid enough to advise him on this one. Do you say, everybody told my dad we couldn't build the aqueduct, and he did? Or do you say, maybe we need to go a different way on this? That's probably the most important decision he'll still have to make. He's going to have to make it by himself. There's really nobody who can tell him what to do on that. Texas and Florida are apparently moving ahead with high-speed rail using a different model that's a little bit more private sector and a little less public sector. If those are successful, that'll put a lot of pressure on the governor on how to look at this. Or he may find the resources to put this together and make it happen. I think it's going to be a really, really hard call for him to make. So at the end of the day, though, in terms of all the politics we've talked about, the Democrats have to deliver for the people who put them into office, for this new coalition, in ways that they don't have the same excuses that President Obama has. You know, President Obama's excuse, it's a pretty good one, is that the opposing party has simply blocked things from me. But you know what? You can only get so far with that. Let me give you an example of that. In 2012, the pollsters for the Obama re-election campaign discovered a catastrophic decline in his approval rating among Latino voters. It was quite sudden. And they couldn't figure it out. You know what the theory is in the Democratic Party? We don't really have to do much for our base because where are they going to go? By the way, those of you who have had friends who've acted that way with you, you know it. Usually the friendship doesn't last a whole long time. No, you know, where's he going to go? Where's she going to go? You know, I may not be a great friend, but geez, look at the other people out there. In politics, what you want is people to say, "You are my person. You're taking care of me. I'm going to go back and vote for you the next time." They were taking Latinos for granted. Oh, by the way, their argument was, God, we gave it everything we had and the Republicans stopped immigration reform. We're done. Well, you know, that argument doesn't fly after a while because people don't sit there and say, well, now I get it, because the Constitution, as you know, really guarantees conflict, and that conflict is very difficult to overcome. So if you don't do anything about my relatives who are going to be deported, my kids, you know, who we brought over for no fault of their own are going to get deported, that's fine, I understand. No, instead they said, we don't approve. And if we don't approve, we're probably not going to vote. We may not vote against you, but we may not show up. And it was out of that that the decision was made to provide the possibility for young people who were brought over illegally to be able to apply to not have them subject to deportation, which opened up all kinds of possibilities for them to work, to travel. It was a wonderful godsend, and the response he got from the Latino community was very positive. Now, you know that's happening again right now. His support is dropping again among Latino voters, which redounds against Democrats in California as well. And he is saying, as he said previously, I have no power to do anything. There has to be comprehensive reform. I don't think that position is going to last in the same way that it didn't last previously. Well, in California, Democrats have to deliver for this ascendant coalition that came in without busting the budget. So the governor probably isn't going to support universal pre-care. What is it, the earlier year, kindergarten. Preschool. Probably is not going to support that, even though it's very popular among Democrats. But they are clearly looking for things to support that are within the budget. And the legislators especially want to have some stuff out there this year. There's other issues that could be a real big problem. One is fracking. I have to think there's got to be a better name for that than fracking. But, I mean, it just feels like we're having a different discussion. But fracking, which the governor partially supports and partially opposed, but the Democratic convention the other day pretty much unanimously voted that it should be stopped completely, is going to be a real tough issue for the governor. So there's a lot of things coming up that will divide Democrats. So for people who are pro-business, moderate Republicans, socially liberal on many issues, the openings now are actually greater than they were before all these events occurred. Because again, there are issues that divide the Democrats on which Republicans have a position. Example is school reform, which completely divides Democrats. Democrats don't get along on school reform at all. Fracking and other environmental issues, high-speed rail and water, where new coalitions are really possible across party lines. Last thought before I take your questions. My main concern as a teacher is always the next generation coming up. That's why I think about this all the time. I think about this at the Pat Brown Institute. I think about how this world that I've described looks to them. And 90% of what I said in their eyes is just noise. Excuses. You know, you told me I should vote. You know, what does a vote do? What does a vote mean? So I think as a political scientist, as a concerned parent, as a resident of California, we can't leave this state, you know, as we get older, without a generation coming in that has some sense that they can bring about changes that will improve their lives and their opportunities, whether those changes are made by Democrats or by Republicans or by Dan Schnur, you know, the decline to state folks. But from where they're sitting, I can understand it just looks like a lot of excuses. Now, when I was growing up in politics, there were somewhat fewer obstacles, hard as it is to believe. We're never going to go back to a period of bipartisanship, of love and friendship between the parties. We're still going to fight everything out. It's going to be bitter. It's going to be ugly. But from the standpoint of those kids coming up, all that matters is, does something come out of that makes a difference to them? And how do we keep them from getting discouraged if it takes longer than they would like it to take? And this is Leadership California. You are leaders. Now what that means is you've got to consider how many of the people who are following you have that point of view. That I don't need to pay attention, it's not going to make a difference, how long is it going to take, what might happen, what might improve, will I be able to go to college, will I be able to own a home, will I be able to raise a family in the state, will I be safe, will I be healthy? What are you doing to make those things happen? And how long do I have to wait? Well, you might have to tell people it's not going to be tomorrow, but that you're not going to give up until that happens. Stick with me. Don't go anywhere. Stick with me. I mean, you're literally holding people in who are about to fly off. And once they fly off, by the way, you'll never get them back. You know, all these people who voted for the first time in 2008, if they're flying off by 2014, then they're breaking the pattern historically, which is your first vote locks you in, then your second vote locks you in, and then you're a voter for life. But that doesn't include the people who get discouraged and disappear. And I think there's a decent chance we'll never see them again. And that's a pretty disheartening thing. But at least it puts out there the task for all of us, which is not just to be the knowledgeable, informed people, but to make sure that everybody in the society sees what a difference they can make. Thanks. I'll step back. I have lots of time. I was told that this is a group that won't really have any questions. So
Yeah, right.
we could just stop here. I'm sure that nobody has anything they want to say.
Right.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Fiona Mall. I was in the Assembly 2006 to 2012, Speaker Pro Tem, and I just want to add something to